Thanks, David. The most dramatic events in the region, in fact, in the world this year, have been what's been called the Arab Spring, the democracy uprisings all over the Arab world and North Africa. Now, they didn't come from nowhere. Take Egypt, the most important country in the region. The movement, as you probably know, was initiated by a group of kind of tech-savvy, fairly young people who call themselves the April 6th movement. Why April 6th? The reason is because on April 6th, 2008, the Egyptian labor movement, which has been very active and militant for many years, had organized, were planning major strike actions at the most important industrial installation in Egypt, along with solidarity actions elsewhere. It was crushed by the dictatorship, the U.S.-backed dictatorship. So it's not known here, but they didn't forget it in Egypt. That's normal. And so that's the April 6th movement. The young people named themselves after that. The movement really, the current uprising gained significant force when the Egyptian labor movement joined into it. And that continues. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a major strike at an industrial installation in the Delta north of Cairo, Shibin al-Kum, which had a repetition of earlier actions before. The earlier ones had been crushed. This one was successful in raising very low wages and slightly improving horrible working conditions of the kind that prevail under the U.S.-backed dictatorship, of course, not only in Egypt, all over the world. And the same is true elsewhere. Take a look at each of these uprisings. You find they have they have deep roots. There are two countries in the region, the general region, two countries that are under long and harsh military occupation, including transfer of populations from the invading country in violation of international law, in violation of Security Council orders and other crimes. Actually, this wave of uprisings began in one of them in November in Western Sahara. The Western Sahara was invaded by, it's the last African colony. It's under the jurisdiction of the United Nations. It's supposed to undergo decolonization. But in 1975, it was invaded by Morocco. Morocco has instituted a military rule that's sent in large numbers of Moroccans to try to flood the area so they can claim to take it over. There have been many protests by the Sahrawis, the native population, and last November they did set up a tent city in the capital, the nonviolent protest, which was crushed by Moroccan troops. This was brought to the Security Council. It's under their jurisdiction. They wanted to call an inquiry, but France, which is the protector of Western African dictators, including Tunisia, France intervened and blocked the inquiry. Well, that's one of the two countries. The other one is Palestine. Remains under firm grip. I'll return to that at the end. For the West, the democracy uprisings are fraught with danger for good reasons. And there are good reasons why the Western powers, the U.S. and its allies, will do whatever they can to try to constrain and reverse them. To find out the reasons, it's sufficient to take a look at the polls of the region. There are good, careful polls taken by the leading Western polling agencies, released by prestigious institutions, Brookings and others. They're not reported. They're much too important to be reported, but planners certainly know them. And if you take a look at the polls, you find out why democracy is intolerable to the West. And this goes way back. So, for example, in Egypt, the most important country, 90% of the population regard the major threat to them as the United States. Tiny percentage regard Iran as a threat, about 10% throughout the region. Opposition to Western policies, U.S. policies, is so strong that in Egypt, 80% of the population think the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. Figures vary throughout the region, but it's roughly on that order. So it's obvious that democracy, authentic democracy, can't be tolerated. Democracy in which popular opinion influences policy. And that goes way back. So take one crucial moment. In 1958, President Eisenhower discussed with his staff, secretly now declassified, he was concerned with what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world. And not from the governments, they're okay, but from the population. And the National Security Council, the major planning agency, had just released a memorandum about it in which they said that, explained it, they said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh, brutal dictatorships and blocks democracy and development, and that we do so because we want to maintain control over their energy supplies. And they went on to say that the perception is more or less accurate, and furthermore, that's pretty much what we should be doing. As long as the population can be kept under control, who cares about the what they think? And that runs right to the present. One of the most striking revelations from WikiLeaks was not so much about the report, but about the reaction to it here. You probably remember that the leak that got the most publicity, made the headlines and so on, was that the Arab states support the United States on Iran. And it quoted the Arab dictators. The Arab dictators said, yeah, we like what you're doing on Iran. What about the Arab population? And there were euphoric reactions. We're in good shape. All over the press and commentary. What about the Arab population? Well, they're quiet, so they're kept under control, so who cares? 90% think we're the worst enemy and Iran should have nuclear weapons. Well, irrelevant. That's basically our conception of democracy. It's not the only case. And it continues as long as the population can be maintained under control, kept under control, as long as the dictators we impose are obedient, then it's fine. The background for all of this is also not particularly obscure. It's pretty much what the National Security Council mentioned in the 1950s. Control over the energy resources. Control, notice, we didn't use them in that time, but it was important to control them, the world's major energy resources. And that's made clear constantly. In fact, it was made very clear just a couple of weeks ago in another interesting event which wasn't reported. There's an international tribunal at The Hague in the Netherlands. This was the tribunal on atrocities in Sierra Leone. The prosecution rested its case a couple of weeks ago. The prosecution was not satisfied with the case. The chief prosecutor, a U.S. law professor, informed the London Times that they wanted to try Colonel Gaddafi. They claimed that the prosecution had evidence that he was the primary funder and responsible for the training, and in their words, he and his colleague, British colleague, in their words, he was responsible for the death of over 1 million people. But Britain and the United States intervened to prevent their friend Gaddafi from being tried at the tribunal. This is not ancient history. I'm talking about a few weeks ago. It's highly relevant today. The prosecutor was asked, why did they intervene? And his answer was quite simple. Welcome to the world of oil. That's correct. That's the phrase that you should keep in mind when you want to think about this region. And from these simple considerations, you can pretty well anticipate what the reaction of the U.S. and its allies is going to be. Where there's an oil-rich country and the dictator is reliable and obedient, he's given free rein. The most important, of course, is Saudi Arabia, the most repressive regime in the region. U.S. main ally, has most of the oil. There was, as in other countries of the region, there was an effort to have a Friday protest. The security forces were so intimidating that people were unwilling even to appear on the streets. So that wasn't even crushed, couldn't even start. Same is true in Kuwait, other major oil producer. Interesting, important case is Bahrain. There were nonviolent protests. They're brutally crushed. A Saudi-led military force invaded to provide the muscle so that the domestic security forces could crush the protests. They invaded the major medical complex, the Salmania medical complex. Patients thrown out, disappeared somewhere, doctors too. All of this is fine, a little tap on the wrist now and then. The human rights activists are being arrested and tortured. No serious protest. And Bahrain is important, not for oil, but because, for one thing, it hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the major military force in the whole area. But more important than that, Bahrain is, the dictatorship is Sunni, and the majority of the population is Shiite, and it's right across the causeway from Saudi Arabia, eastern Saudi Arabia, which is largely Shiite. Dictatorship is Sunni, and that happens to be where most of Saudi oil is. By some accident of history and geography, the concentration of the world's energy is in the northern Gulf region, which happens to be largely Shiite. Eastern Saudi Arabia, southern Iraq, and those sectors of Iran nearby. And there has been considerable concern in the West for a long time that some kind of tacit alliance might form in these Shiite areas, which would move towards a degree of independence and would control the bulk of the world's oil. That would be a very serious development. So crushing the uprising, democracy uprising, Bahrain is of significance far beyond the significance of Bahrain itself. This concern about Shiite-Sunni confrontation is largely the result of the American invasion of Iraq. There had been tensions going way back, but they were never very serious. There was a lot of intermarriage. The communities were intermingled in all sorts of ways. But one consequence of the invasion of Iraq was to set off a very harsh and bitter Sunni-Shiite conflict, which spread to the whole region, Lebanon and beyond. So now it's a major confrontation. That's why Bahrain is treated in the Sunni Arab world as a confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the sort of leading figures of these two sides. That's one of the, if you like, collateral damage, the side effects of the invasion of Iraq, which is poisoning the region and can have, is already having major consequences and could be much worse. There had been and remains another severe confrontation in the region. This is not Sunni-Shiite, but rather Sunni dictatorships, which is the majority of the region, versus secular nationalism. That's been a serious issue for a long time. The United States and Britain, the main imperial powers, have consistently supported radical Islamic fundamentalism, including, crucially, Saudi Arabia, which is both the ideological center of radical Islam. It's the place where the funding is for the spread of madrasas that teach the Quran and jihad and so on. And Saudi Arabia is also the major funder of jihadism, but it's also the main U.S. ally, and it's been the main British ally for a long time. And the reason is it's regarded as a barrier against secular nationalism, which could become independent, and that's the real problem, not just in that region, but anywhere. Independence is what can't be tolerated, and independence has been associated with secular nationalism in the region. Actually, the tight relation between Israel and the United States was really established in 1967 when Israel performed a major service to the United States. There was at the time, a war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, Nasser's Egypt. That was the center of secular nationalism in the region. Saudi Arabia is the leading center of radical Islamic fundamentalism. And Israel did pretty much destroyed secular Arab nationalism, which was considered a great gift to the United States, defending the radical Islamic fundamentalist, anti-nationalist centers, and that established the strategic relationship, which in fact still exists. In the case of Yemen, which is very brutal also, hundreds of people killed and so on, there the issue is not oil, but Yemen is a U.S. ally. The U.S. is carrying out military operations there and so on, and also a Saudi ally, so therefore they're allowed to kill as many people as they liked. In the case of Egypt, where there's no major oil issue, though it's the major country in the region, in the case of Egypt and also Tunisia, the United States followed a very traditional game plan over and over again. It's happened many times. There comes a point when it becomes difficult to sustain your favored dictator. So there's a procedure. The procedure is support the dictator as long as possible. If he can't be sustained any longer, maybe the army turns against him or the business classes or whatever, then send him off to pasture somewhere, issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy and commitment to freedom and so on, and then try to restore the old regime, maybe under different names. Happens over and over. You have to really be blind not to see it. Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Somoza in Nicaragua, Chun in South Korea, Suharto in Indonesia, Mobutu in the Congo. You just list them all. Ceausescu in Romania, favorite dictator in the Eastern Zone. So it happens over and over, and that's essentially what the United States is doing right now in Egypt and also Tunisia. France helped primarily in Tunisia. There's a lot that's been achieved, but the regimes are still in place. In Egypt, the country is still run by the military, as it has been for 50 years. The high military command is very deeply embedded in the economy and the dominant elite repressive system. They're not going to give it up easily. And they are heavily armed by the United States, trained by the U.S., close connections to U.S. military and so on. They'll be backed. What the outcome will be is uncertain. Protests are continuing. There have been substantial gains. The press is free for the first time. The labor movement, as I mentioned, is now able to organize much more freely. There will be some sort of elections, but the conflict is still continuing, like in other situations where a dictator had to be sort of shelved and you have to reconstruct the regime. Well, there is another category. That's the one in the headlines. What happens when you have an oil-rich country with a dictator who's not reliable? Libya, in other words. There have been plenty of Western support for Libya. I mentioned one example right up to the present, Britain and the U.S. Preventing Gaddafi from prosecution for crimes in Sierra Leone. That's not the only case. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, my hometown, the Harvard Business School there's an offshoot of the business school which has a project. It's called the Monitor Project, a business project, which has been providing public relations and other assistance to Gaddafi. One of the things they did was help his son, Saif, fake a PhD dissertation at the London School of Economics. Caused a kind of a scandal there when the West turned against Gaddafi. The director, Harold Evans, had to resign. Other scandals. They were also producing. They were also bringing Western academics, leading Western academics to Harvard professors and others to Libya to sit with Gaddafi in his tent and listen to his disquisitions on democracy and human rights and so on, and to help him improve his rhetoric. Luckily for them, it didn't happen. The tide turned before they could do it, but they were planning. They had presented, in fact, a monograph for him extolling his wisdom and brilliance, which he was to release, and so on. Well, that's a kind of. There's plenty more like it. This both in the United States and in Britain. But he's not reliable. He's a kind of a loose cannon. So it would be better to have him replaced if possible. This issue came to a head when Gaddafi's forces were reaching Benghazi, and Obama's main Middle East advisor, Dennis Ross, warned that if Gaddafi's forces entered Benghazi and carried out a massacre, which was not unlikely, it would be blamed on us, on the United States, and it wouldn't look good, so we better do something about it. So therefore, at that point, the U.S. did join with Britain and France in backing a UN Security Council resolution, 1763, which is called a no-fly, supposed to impose a no-fly zone. Well, the triumvirate, the U.S., Britain, and France, notice the three traditional imperial powers. The imperial triumvirate immediately, who are really the only ones involved, except marginally others, they immediately went beyond 1763. If you've been reading the press, you've been seeing it. So a ceasefire was imposed on Gaddafi's forces, but not on the rebel forces. So when rebel forces advanced to the west towards the major cities in central Libya, there was no ceasefire imposed. In fact, they were supported. The bombing was supporting them. So in other words, what is in fact happening is that the Western powers are participating in a limited way in the rebellion. Maybe they should be, maybe they shouldn't be. That's a separate question, but that's their interpretation of 1763. And it's worth noting that the triumvirate is quite isolated on this. It's an African country. The African Union is opposed. They want a ceasefire and negotiations. The Arab states have given very tepid support. They're all very heavily armed, but they're not participating. Qatar sent a couple of reconnaissance planes, but that's symbolic. And they've also objected to the interpretation of 1763. The major regional power, Turkey, has just been standing back. They're again a NATO power, huge military. They could have imposed the no-fly zone themselves if they wanted, but they've refused to participate at all. There was just a conference in China of what are called the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the emerging economies. Just a couple of days ago, they issued a joint final declaration meeting in China, Sanya Declaration, opposing Western airstrikes in Libya and calling for a peaceful solution. They said, we share the principle that the use of force should be avoided. Well, again, you can agree or disagree, but that's a huge segment of world opinion, in fact, the large majority of the population. So, in fact, if you look across the world, the triumvirate, whatever you think of their actions, is isolated. Almost nobody's supporting the imperial triumvirate. The U.S. has been kind of reluctant about the whole thing. It's now backed off. The most influential cabinet member, Secretary of Defense Gates, has been opposed from the beginning. He pointed out that a no-fly zone can't do anything. You're going to have to send arms to the rebels. They're an untrained force. I mean, like if somebody gave me a Kalashnikov, I wouldn't know what to do with it, let alone a rocket-propelled launcher or whatever they're called. So they're going to have to be trained. And if you send in trainers, they're military forces or contractors, mercenaries, you have to send in combat troops to protect them, and pretty soon it's off and running. So for that reason, he was opposed. Obama's backed off. Britain and the United States are unenthusiastic. They've proposed sending arms, but then backed off, presumably for similar reasons. The preponderance of power in the world was made very clear in this operation. It was led by France and Britain, but they couldn't carry it off. When they needed muscle, they had to turn to the United States. So in the early part, and they're heavily armed, the military powers, with, of course, a huge imperial history. But they had to call on the United States to do the heavy lifting. So in the early days of the intervention, it was almost all U.S. Tomahawk missiles, attack fighters, and so on. When the U.S. backs off, the mission declines. The Arab press, from the beginning, has been, the London-based Arab press, not in the region, has been predicting that it's going to end up in a stalemate with a partition, an east-west partition, and the crucial question will be what happens to the oil fields. If you take a look at the map, you'll see that the area of the fighting, the area where the stalemate is, Ajdabiya, Brega, and those places, that's right about in the fault line. That's right pretty much where the known oil fields are located. And whoever gets control of those in an eventual partition will essentially be the rich part of the country. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that most of Libya, vast territory, is unexplored, and oil experts suspect that there must be plenty of oil there. Also, Libyan oil happens to be very valuable. It's very easily refined and so on. Well, anyway, that's where the situation stands in Libya. Now, there is, as I mentioned, a second country that's under military occupation, long military occupation. That's Palestine. The Arab League called for a no-fly zone over Gaza. I don't even know if that gets reported here, but certainly no talk of implementing it because it doesn't serve U.S. purposes. So therefore it's irrelevant, like popular opinion. For Israel, like other Western states, Arab democracy would be quite a dangerous development, partly for the reasons I mentioned and partly beyond. So a democratic government in Egypt is not too likely to maintain the position of support for Israeli actions that the dictatorship has supported. That means, first of all, the occupation and the expanding occupation and the pretty horrifying siege of Gaza, but also other actions like since the Israel-Egypt peace treaty was signed in 1979, Israel's invaded its northern neighbor, Lebanon, 4 times. Again, brutal attacks, all supported by the U.S. In fact, the U.S. participates. Otherwise, they couldn't carry them out. And that's expedited by the fact that the major Arab deterrent, Egypt, has pulled out of the region, pulled out of the conflict. And Israel, of course, understood that right away in 1979. You read Israeli strategic analysts at the time, they said with Egypt removed, we can concentrate on actions elsewhere, taking over the occupied territories, attacking northern neighbor, and so on. A democratic government might not go along with that. Israel also is facing several crises, two in particular. If you read the Israeli press, you know that they're deeply concerned about what they call delegitimation. And they have a right to be concerned. They're becoming an international pariah state. The Human Rights Watch, which is a pretty conservative organization, it came out with an appeal recently to the United States, I'll quote it, to suspend financing to Israel in an amount equivalent to the costs of Israel's spending in support of settlements, and also to monitor contributions to Israel from tax-exempt U.S. organizations that violate international law, including prohibitions against discrimination. That cuts a pretty broad, casts a pretty wide net. It would eliminate most of the private funding organizations. Amnesty International had earlier called for an arms embargo in the middle of the Gaza war, arguing that the arms were being used in violation of international law, and they could have added, but didn't, that the arms, almost all from the U.S., are a violation of U.S. law, which specifically requires that any arms transferred to a country be used solely for self-defense or for maintaining internal order, which certainly was not the case here. Well, those are significant dangers. They're also large. The Human Rights Watch also called on Europe, main trading partner, to boycott goods from the settlements or stop any activity, any contact with organizations, businesses, whatever, in Israel that are involved in any way in the occupation. That the occupation is illegal, it has never been in question. Not the occupation, but activities undertaken to maintain the occupation. In particular, any transfer of populations, any settlements are in violation of the most basic principles of international humanitarian law. Now, that was recognized right away in 1967. In fact, Israel itself recognized it, and it's been reiterated by the Security Council, by the International Court of Justice. It's not arguable. So yes, everything's illegal, and any participation in any of those activities is illegal. And Israel's concerned about it because there is a popular movement growing which supports this point of view, and is even reaching organizations like Human Rights Watch. So that's the delegitimation. Getting worse in a moment, but I'll just mention that there's also a problem of legitimation that concerns them, namely legitimation of the Palestinian Authority and their rights. And that's a problem, too. It's going to come up very sharply in a couple of months at the coming UN session in September, when it looks as though the Palestinians will press forward an effort at the General Assembly and the Security Council to be admitted into the United Nations as a state. They're already supported by probably 80 or 90% of the governments that represent about 80, 90% of the world's population, including important ones like Brazil and others. The only thing blocking it really is the United States. It's possible the United States will be driven to another of its long series of vetoes to protect Israeli crimes. The most recent was February, when a Security Council resolution was vetoed by the United States. It called for implementing official U.S. policy. That's why it was a little unusual. Official U.S. policy is that the settlements shouldn't be expanded. That was the basic content of the resolution, which the Obama administration vetoed. It also declared the settlements to be illegal, but that, as I said, hasn't been in question for 45 years. The And there may be another one coming up this September. And this is another case where the U.S. Happens to be extremely isolated. And it's not the only one. I'll finish with one of the most important ones. I mentioned before that the Arab world overwhelmingly supports, even not only supports Iran's nuclear programs, but even thinks they ought to develop nuclear weapons, which goes way beyond that. In Egypt, 80%. The core U.S. policy program at the moment, what's regarded as the leading foreign policy issue, is the Iranian threat. This is called the Year of Iran, and foreign policy journals and so on are full of commentary on the terrible Iranian threat. On this issue, too, the U.S. happens to be very isolated in the region, certainly. The large majority of the population supports Iran on this issue, doesn't regard Iran as a threat, and even thinks it should go beyond and develop nuclear weapons. Turkey, the major power in the region and the most respected, is improving relations with Iran. The U.S. is complaining that they're violating U.S. sanctions, but of course U.S. sanctions have no authority. No reason for anyone to accept them except fear of power. And they're increasing trade with Iran. They're very natural trading partners. In fact, they just announced they're going to triple trade with Iran, and they've established a pipeline. Same is true of Brazil, which is the most respected country in the South, the third world, has been combining. In fact, it joined Turkey in an effort to settle the enrichment issue outside the framework of U.S. power, which led to a lot of denunciations here. The non-aligned countries, which are most of the world, for all along they've been vigorously supporting Iran's right to develop nuclear energy as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the world is disregarded. If you read commentary here, Iran is defying the international community, which is technically correct. The phrase international community has a technical meaning. It means Washington and whoever happens to agree with it at the moment. That's the international community. So if, like, the whole world disagrees, they're not part of the international community. It's very much like the Arab public. If there's a campaign of hatred against us and they think Iran should have nuclear weapons, it's not real because the dictators support us. Incidentally, there's an analog to that at home, but that's a different topic. In general, the world is kind of drifting out of control. If you go back to, the early 70s, when the Nixon administration was planning to overthrow the parliamentary government of Chile, institute a dictatorship, the National Security Council warned that if the United States can't control Latin America, it's going to have a hard time controlling the rest of the world. The U.S. can no longer control Latin America. In the last decade or so, South America, for the first time in 500 years, has started to become integrated and move towards independence. They're out of control. You could see that again on Obama's last trip to South America a couple of weeks ago. Asia has drifted out of control. The Middle East is now moving in that direction. The Middle East is a critically important area. That's the center of the world's energy supplies. All of this leads to broader issues of world order, topics actually that I'll talk about in a couple of hours somewhere else, but no time to go into here. I'll stop there.
People come to the mics, and then we'll just go back and forth. Do you want me to call on them? Let me just remind folks again. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll have a question and answer, and so folks who want to ask a question, please line up. And again, please remember, keep them a short question. Even if you disagree with what he said, ask a question respectfully for him to reply to that. So I guess we'll start over here, and then Professor Chomsky will go back and forth picking folks.
Professor Chomsky, in a few weeks there'll be another Freedom Flotilla challenging the Israeli siege of the Gaza Strip. Can you comment on how you think that might progress or what the implications might be?
Well, like everything else in the region, it depends on how the U.S. reacts. The last, you were on one of the ones that managed to get through. Most of them haven't gotten through. They've been stopped by the Israeli Navy. Actually, one was blown up in Cyprus Harbor a long time ago. But the most recent one was last May. That's the Mavi Marmara, a Turkish-based ship, was part of the flotilla, and Israeli commandos landed on it in international waters. That's piracy, hijacking. They killed 9 crew members, including an American citizen. It was a huge protest over the world, but support in the United States. So Congress passed resolutions saying it was fine. If the boss agrees, nothing much is going to happen. Doesn't matter what the world thinks. In Israel itself, Israel has moved very far to the right, to the jingoist right. Probably 95% of the population in Israel regards the attack on the ship, the Mavi Marmara, as defensive, and that the commandos were attacked by the passengers and so on. And if that position is also taken in the United States, Israel will be emboldened to do the same thing this time or something similar. But notice that there would be no problem if they wanted to stop the ships nonviolently. I mean, you don't have to be a big expert to realize that the Navy could disable the rudder and tow the ship to port. They have no right to do that. You don't have a right to carry out piracy in international waters unless you're supported by the master of the world. If the U.S. authorizes it, you have a right to do anything you like, but just as the U.S. itself does. But otherwise not, like Somali pirates aren't allowed to do it. But they may, given the mood in the country and the estimate of the U.S. reaction, they might, again, stop it in a violent fashion, as they have in the past. That depends pretty much on us. These are matters that we can control. These are not things happening on Mars. It depends very much on what the U.S. population is willing to tolerate and support.
Hi, first I want to say thank you. And my question maybe sort of goes along with that. Regarding what's happening in Egypt, as well as the murders of settlers, activist Giuliano and Vittorio Arrigoni, during a time that Hamas and Fatah are trying to hold unity talks, what do you think the next moves are for Israel, and where do you think they're going?
What should they do, or what will they do?
What will they do? I mean, there is sort of a ramping up in Gaza with the Operation Scorching Summer.
Well, what they will do is exactly what they are doing, and will continue to do as long as the U.S. supports it. We should bear in mind that the framework of discussion of this topic in the United States is completely skewed. So, like you read the newspapers, they tell you there's a peace process in which the U.S. is an honest broker trying to bring together two recalcitrant opponents. The truth of the matter is totally different. If there were serious negotiations going on, they'd be run by some neutral party, and on one side would be the U.S. and Israel, and on the other side would be the entire world. Because on this issue, the U.S. is totally isolated, literally. So as long as the U.S. continues to support Israeli policies, they'll continue to carry them out. They'll go as far as the U.S. will accept, and as far as the U.S. and it's not just acceptance, it's participation every Israeli crime is an American crime. They can only go so far as U.S. participation permits. That includes military support, diplomatic support, economic support, and in fact ideological support, like framing the issues. If U.S. government continues to support them, meaning the U.S. population allows that, then Israel will continue its siege of Gaza, which is an act of war. Israel's first, no question about that, and its continued expansion into the West Bank, which is essentially taking over roughly 50% of it and leaving the rest in isolated cantons. So that's what they will do. What should they do? Well, assuming that suppose the U.S. changes its policy and the U.S. joins the world, okay, not totally utopian notion, but maybe far out, but not inconceivable. If the U.S. were to join the world, Israel would have to do what the master says, and it would accept a two-state settlement. The basic terms of a settlement of this has been known for 35 years. I mean, you can argue about details, but they were stated in a Security Council resolution in January 1976 brought by the Arab states, major Arab states, which called for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized borders. And then they brought in the wording of UN 242, which everyone accepts as the major diplomatic document that called for recognition of the right of every state in the region to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized boundaries on the international border. That's supported by essentially the entire world. Arab League, Iran, everyone supports it, but except the U.S. The U.S. vetoed it in 1976, and I won't go through the rest of the record, but it stays about the same. But if the U.S. were to join the world, Israel could move to join the world as well, accept a two-state settlement. That would improve its security. Security has never been the issue. Israel has been, U.S., when I say Israel, I mean the U.S. and Israel, because they work in tandem, have been, since the early 90s, following a very definite policy of trying to separate Gaza from the West Bank. That's in explicit violation of the Oslo Accords, which they had just signed, which call them a territorial unity. So they would then reverse that and allow the two parts of Palestine to reunite and be connected somehow. Not hard to figure out how. They would end the siege of Gaza and accept a truce, which would very likely end all conflict. There was a truce for a couple of months back in 2008, and Israel concedes that Hamas didn't fire a single rocket during the truce, even though Israel didn't live up to it. It maintained the siege and then finally broke the truce, but they could reinstate that. And open up Gaza to international commerce and trade and development, and stop crushing it. These are all perfectly feasible policies, but it depends on what the U.S. will do. And I should say that there's some. Let me go off on a little bit of a tangent. There are historical analogies which are worth thinking about. Like it's very common to stress, talk about comparisons between Israel and South Africa. Most of them are pretty dubious for lots of reasons, but there's one that's accurate and very important for Americans to understand, which is, I suppose, the reason why it's never discussed. But there's one that's accurate. Back around 1960, the white nationalist regime in South Africa recognized that it was becoming an international pariah. And the foreign minister called in the American ambassador. All of this is long declassified. Called in the American ambassador and told him, look, we're becoming an international pariah. We're getting voted down in the United Nations. Everyone's denouncing us. He said, but none of this matters because you and I both understand that there's only one vote at the United Nations, namely yours. As long as you back us, doesn't matter what the world thinks. And that turned out to be accurate. By the 1970s, the UN passed an arms embargo in the 1980s. Corporations were pulling out. Even Congress was passing sanctions. The Reagan administration, which was very strongly pro-apartheid, continued to support South Africa, even violating congressional sanctions, and they had a reason. The reason was the war on terror. The African National Congress, Mandela's ANC, was in 1988, that late, was condemned officially as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. In fact, Mandela himself was just taken off the terrorist list 2 years ago and allowed to come to the United States, without special dispensation. Well, in the context of the war on terror, the U.S. continued to support the South African regime. They looked completely triumphant. They could do anything they wanted. Around 1990, U.S. policy shifted, and within a couple of years, apartheid collapsed. That's not the only case. The world is not ruled by law. It's ruled by force. We may not like it, but it's true. The world is ruled by force. The force is mostly in Washington, not entirely, but mostly. And if the U.S. changes its policy, things can change. And it depends a lot on what happens among the population. It's not a dictatorship. They can do what the population permits and tolerates. So it's possible that the U.S. would shift its policy, as it did in South Africa, and there are other cases, in which case I think you can see steps towards a peaceful settlement.
Thank you very much for coming to Oregon, Professor Chomsky. Welcome. A brief follow-up on the flotilla question. Let us not forget the early 60s proven intentional Israeli attack on the USS Liberty. It killed scores of sailors, and nothing was ever done about that either. My question now is about labor unions. I mean, you cited labor unions as inspiring the April 6th movement and the following Arab Spring, and labor unions in the EU have generally helped to win cradle-grave health care, mostly free education to PhDs, 6 weeks paid vacations, generous paid maternity leave for both parents. Most boards of directors have half labor union and worker council members on them in the EU. And here, labor unions are decimated, demonized. Can you ever see the day when unions are strong enough to help create a form of democratic socialism here? And are the pro-union uprising in Wisconsin and elsewhere giving you hope?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's useful to have a little eye on history with regard to both the cases you mentioned. The case of the U.S. Liberty is, for those of you who don't know, it was a U.S. ship which was attacked by Israeli forces in 1967, right at the end of the 1967 war. A couple of dozen crewmen were killed. Israel essentially got complete impunity. It's not the only case. There's one other case of a country which was such a close and valued ally that they were authorized to attack a U.S. ship and kill 35 or 36 crewmen. That's Saddam Hussein. Gaddafi is not the only dictator that the U.S. strongly supports. The Reagan administration was supporting Saddam so enthusiastically that in 1987, when Saddam's forces attacked a U.S. naval vessel with Exocet missiles and disabled it and killed, I think, 36 crewmen, they got off with just a tap on the wrist. Those are things that are worth remembering, too. Those are the only two cases. With regard to the labor unions, again, this is not the first. What you said is exactly right. There's been a huge attack against the union movement ever since the early 50s. It picked up sharply in more recent years. And the reason is very straightforward. Organized labor is the only organized force that stands in the way of something like complete corporate tyranny. Literally. It's not an exaggeration. So, of course, there's a major effort to decimate it. It's not the first time in American history. It's happened repeatedly. So there was a very powerful labor movement in the late 19th century, developed through the early 20th century. It was largely crushed by Woodrow Wilson. These things tend to be bipartisan. Wilson's Red Scare after the First World War crushed labor, independent thought, worst period of repression in American history. The labor movement was practically gone. In fact, one of the leading U.S. labor historian, David Montgomery, has a classic book called The Rise and Fall of American Labor, something like that. And the fall that he's talking about is the 1920s, when it looked as if it was all done. End of history, utopia of the masters, and so on. Period, rather like this. Well, the 1930s came along, labor revived, became a very significant force. It drove the New Deal measures, which were social democratic. And since the 1950s, there's been a concerted effort to beat them back. In fact, you can see how far it's gone by just taking a look at Eisenhower. Eisenhower gave speeches in which he said, everyone in the country said, of course, accepts all the New Deal measures. Maybe a couple of crazed oil executives don't, but anybody who tried to question any of them would be considered too ridiculous to discuss. All right, that's the dominant thrust at the moment. And it's not the first time, and it can be beaten back again. But that's why what happened in Wisconsin was pretty important.
And there is no teachers' labor union here.
What?
I've heard there's no teachers' union here either.
Teachers' union?
Yeah, here at Pacific University. There should be.
I don't know. You have to ask people here. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'm Will Seaman with KBOO Community News. On the issue of why the United States continues to support Israel to the degree it does, in recent years, one explanation that's gained some currency is the so-called Israel lobby. However, you've also spoken in the past about the strategic asset theory, and I wonder if you'd talk, even if briefly, about those two explanations for U.S. policy and how you weigh the likelihood of one or another or the influence of one or another.
Well, the Israel lobby is a powerful lobby, but no ethnic-based lobby is strong enough to overcome the major concentrations of U.S. power. They can, as long as the AIPAC, the Israel lobby, it more or less acts within the framework of U.S. power, they can get what they want. If they try to step beyond it, they're stopped instantly. And there's case after case. I could run through them. But in general, you take a look at the way American politics works. Ethnic lobbies can have influence, like the gun lobby. The gun lobby is very militant. They're a minority of the population, but there's no real organized opposition to them, so they get what they want. Okay, but on the other hand, if there were organized opposition, say if the Chamber of Commerce came out against them, they'd disappear. Okay, but and it's pretty much the same here. You take a look at the support for Israel, what's called support for Israel. In the press, the most extreme support is the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is not part of AIPAC. The Wall Street Journal is the journal of the business community. In the political system, the two parties are not very different, but somewhat different. The Republicans are, don't even pretend to be anything but the business party. They're deep in the pockets of corporate America. They're the most extreme pro-Israel group. The Democrats, too, they're a little more diverse, but they follow along. You take a look at there's a major lobby which strongly supports Israel, the military lobby. That dwarfs AIPAC. And they think Israel's great, like Lockheed Martin, for instance, or Boeing, or any of them. When the U.S. provides arms to Israel, the money goes into their pockets. Furthermore, it's a double effect because Saudi Arabia comes along and says, we want some of that stuff too. So you sell them second-grade arms, which they don't know how to use. And like Obama just signed a $60 billion deal with Saudi Arabia to pour arms into Saudi Arabia, more money into the pockets of Lockheed Martin. So they think it's great. You want to run the F-35 line, that's the way you do it. But it goes beyond that. Take high-tech industry. So take, say, Intel, not far from here. They are establishing a new generation of chips, which they think will sweep the global market. Their main facility, they're building in Israel. Okay, it's a good place for it. A lot of high-tech support, government support, trained personnel, so fine, they'll support it. And in fact, high-tech industry in general invests pretty heavily in Israel. The strategic relationship remains. Israel remains a very close military and intelligence ally and has a lot of, in fact, so integrated into the U.S. system you really can't distinguish them. There's a lot more. There are cultural factors which it's kind of hard to measure, but they surely exist. So take, say, Christian Zionism. I'm not talking about evangelicals here. I mean just mainstream Christian Zionism. People like Woodrow Wilson. That goes back way before Jewish Zionism, and it's much more. It swept the population much more than Zionism did the Jewish population. So, for example, in the First World War, when the British general Allenby conquered Jerusalem, you take a look at the headlines in the main U.S. press. Richard the Lionhearted has defeated the pagans and restored the Holy Land to us. That's the way it's presented in the main U.S. press. In the Roosevelt administration, which was secular, Harold Ickes, one of Roosevelt's main advisors, kind of a social democrat, he described the return of Jews to Palestine as the Israel, as the land of Israel, as the greatest achievement in human history, because it was fulfilling the words of the Holy Book, And this is a strain that goes way right through. That's apart from evangelical Christianity, a considerable part of the population, which is much more extreme. And that includes people pretty high up, like George W. Bush, for example, literally, and can talk about it if you like. But that's significant. And there's something else that's significant. Political science literature has a concept that they call the Anglosphere, meaning Britain and its offshoots. The Anglosphere is a little unusual in the history of imperialism, not unique, but unusual, in that the Anglosphere, countries like this, or Canada or Australia, these are settler colonial societies. They don't just rule the countries they conquer, they exterminate the population and take them over. That's a very special form of imperialism. And that's deeply rooted in the whole, American picture of the world. And it's justified. If we did it, it must be justified. So, by definition. So there's a whole, the large part of the culture is based on the idea that it's right for superior races to come and get rid of the backward population and take it over and so on. Well, that's what Israel is. It's the last settler colonial society, and that strikes a chord. I don't know how to measure the effect of that, but it's something. In other words, there's plenty of factors that support the strategic relationship which it's sustained. And on the other hand, there's almost nothing going for the Palestinians. They don't offer anything. They don't have wealth. They don't have power. They don't have military force. They have the kind of rights that other indigenous populations had, but who cares about them? And of course, by now it's all mingled with this extreme Islamophobia, which is really reaching almost hysterical proportions in the country. I mean, just recently, for example, a number of state legislatures, Oklahoma, a couple of others, have passed legislation insisting that the state constitutions be changed to block Islamic law. I mean, the chances of Islamic law affecting a court are kind of, -0 or something. But we have to put it in the Constitution. There's a substantial part of the population who think that Obama is trying to institute Sharia, take over the country. It's a pretty wild country in many respects. And these, I don't know how much these, but whatever it is, the Palestinians are caught up in this anti-Arab hysteria, anti-Muslim hysteria. So it's a long haul. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. I reluctantly support my government by paying taxes, and my government then goes and does these things. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on paying federal taxes, and if you pay federal taxes, and if that's really something that we each could do and slow the machine down?
Well, I've thought about it a lot and, in fact, acted on it. In 1965, along with another friend, I tried to organize national tax resistance. We weren't terribly successful, not the greatest organizers in the world, but there wasn't that much support for it. But I didn't pay taxes for about 10 years. It's somewhat risky. They can come down on you. But it's like other kinds of civil disobedience, including much more serious kinds, which I was also involved in. People have different reasons, but in my view, civil disobedience is really a pragmatic issue. You do it if you think its consequences will be favorable. Like, will civil disobedience kind of stimulate other people to say, okay, I can go a little farther than I did? If it can have that effect, it's okay. If it doesn't have that effect, it seems to me it's useless. So, in fact, I stopped in 1975 because it seemed to be useless. Incidentally, I'm not opposed to taxes. I think we're undertaxed. In particular, the wealthy are ridiculously undertaxed. But so taxes are okay. And yes, they do terrible things, but they also do important things. So just not paying taxes in itself doesn't seem to me a sensible tactic unless it's focused and can, in a way which can reach other people who can make them think that they ought to take some other stand.
Some years ago, and I'd have to go back a long time, Noam Chomsky supported a one-state solution in Israel. And then, like a lot of us, recognized that a two-state solution was a good idea. Given the last, let's say, 60, but at least the last 20 years of the nation-building project of Israel, is Noam Chomsky back to a one-state solution like a lot of other people?
Well, I can't go back to it because I never gave it up, except that I never called it a one-state solution. I called it a one-state settlement, which is different from a solution. I have never seen any reason to worship the imperial boundaries. The boundaries there were established by imperial force, by the British and the French. There's no justification that I can see for a boundary cutting the Galilee in half between what's called Israel and Lebanon. So I think there are better settlements off in the distance. But a one-state settlement, which back in more rational times was called a binational state, that makes good sense. And I know of only one way to approach it. I mean, we can, there's a pie-in-the-sky approach which says, okay, let's all live in peace. You can say, okay, let's all have one state, fine. That's meaningless. It's meaningless until you sketch a path from here to there. And the only path I know of, maybe some kind can suggest another one, is through a two-state settlement. Not settlement, but not solution, but settlement. A two-state settlement, which is supported by essentially the whole world, would have the effect of reducing the cycle of violence. It would open the possibilities for eroding the boundaries, in a sense, in the way it's happening in Europe, just increasing commercial, cultural, personal, other exchanges. And I think a boundary through that part of the world makes absolutely no sense for anyone, and I think they probably would erode. And you could move towards maybe some kind of federalism, then maybe a binational structure of some sort, and then on to erode the imperial boundaries. So, yeah, I still believe what I did when I was what was called a Zionist youth activist in the 1940s, opposed to a Jewish state. And I think that's right. But the tactics you choose depend on circumstances. You can't pretend that the world doesn't exist. So you have to calibrate tactics to options. And these seem to, maybe somebody has another idea, but these are the only options that I can see.
Hello. This may not be especially topical, but I'm curious to know if you have any comments about the life and legacy of the life and legacy of the late anarchist Alexander Berkman. I've always been curious to know if you had any comments on that.
Oh, Alexander Berkman? Yeah, well, ABCs of Communist Anarchism is still worth reading. Shooting Frick was not a good idea. But, you pick and choose. Yeah.
Mr. Chomsky, thank you for coming today. We live where we can make a difference, every single one of us. Some people do. I'm on the front page of the newspaper. My name's Ryan Wiley. I protested the war recently. And what can individuals in this room do to shift that policy of what's going on? Can we actually make a difference?
Oh, sure. We can make a huge difference.
Individuals in this room.
I mean, look, take Egypt, say. I mean, the people in Tahrir Square are facing difficulties and repression vastly beyond anything that we can think of. But they did it. Back in, say, 1960, when a couple of young black students sat in a lunch counter, they were, again, facing the kind of violence and repression that none of us face. But they did it. They faced the repression, finally got somewhere. That's the way things change. We have a huge range of options, virtually anything. It's a pretty free society. I mean, you can complain about this and that, but by historical or comparative standards, it's a pretty free society, which means there are any number of options, from civil disobedience to legislative to protests to organization to educational activities. They all matter. In the long run, they add up.
So just to clarify, every single person in this room can make a difference?
Absolutely. Now, take a look at our own history, what's happening right now.
Thank you.
I mean, look, in anybody my age, it's a much more civilized country than it was maybe 50 years ago. And the reason is because people did things. A lot of young people did things. I don't know what happened here, but let's say take my own university, MIT. I've been there since 1955. In 1955, you walked down the halls of MIT. It was well-dressed, obedient, deferential white males, period, doing their work. You walk down the halls of MIT today, it kind of looks like this. Half women, third minorities, informal dress, which means informal relationships, a lot of political activism, unheard of then. Well, this happened all over the country, in fact, to an extent all over the world. A lot of it was initiated by young people, and it did civilize the country. In fact, it set off a wave of repression, which tends to follow civilizing the country. So sure, plenty you can do.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. You're a hero from way back in linguistics as well as politics. In history, and you've taught me to do this, I look at who follows the money, and the big money seems to go to international finance. So oil prices go up, and the major beneficiary is international finance. Weapon systems are paid to Lockheed, but we borrow the money, and 10 years later, the biggest beneficiary is international finance. Can you comment on the role of that elephant in the room?
Well, that's a very significant change that took place in the 1970s. I think the major post-war change, post-World War II change, I've always thought was in the early 70s, when the United States abandoned the post-war economic system, Bretton Woods system, and freed up, the basic point was to free up flows of financial capital, deregulate capital. Up until that point, currencies were regulated, capital flows were limited, and so on. And that just changed it was connected with something else. It was connected with the fact that the rate of profit in manufacturing was declining, and you could make more money by financial manipulations than by producing things. Connected with that was the increasing ease of offshoring production. So you could, trade agreements were established, which are called free trade. They have nothing to do with free trade. They're basically agreements which are designed to provide rights for investors and to set working people around the world in competition with one another, and not privileged professionals and others. They're protected. But, of course, investors are privileged. But working people are set in competition with one another, has an obvious effect. it's part of the attack on unions, in fact, that somebody mentioned. And it also has shifted the economy enormously. You go back to, say, the early 70s, financial institutions were part of the economy, but they were doing the job that they're supposed to do in a state capitalist economy. They were taking unused funds, like, say, your bank account, and directing them to some productive use. That's changed enormously. Right before the current crash, there have been repeated crashes since that time, none before. Right before the last crash, financial institutions made about 40% of corporate profit, which is phenomenal. It's not that they're doing anything useful. In fact, they're doing nothing useful for the economy. In fact, they're harming the economy. Now, if we had a capitalist system, this wouldn't happen, because every time there'd be a crash, they'd go out of business. But we don't have luckily, we have a very powerful state which intervenes. And if Goldman Sachs is going to tank, they go to you, the taxpayer, and say, you bail me out, and that's what happens. So they're not subject to market discipline, and that's continuing right at this moment. Like while 20% of the population is qualifying for food stamps, and Congress is telling us we got to reduce that, freeloaders. Goldman Sachs just announced $17.5 billion of compensation for executives, and tripled the base salary of their CEO, and they're richer and bigger than they ever were before, after having been instrumental in creating the last crisis and being bailed out by the taxpayer. Well, that's our kind of capitalism. It's run by financial institutions. So they're extremely powerful. They're quite harmful to the economy. They survive thanks to the fact that the so-called libertarians actually support a very powerful state which intervenes for the benefit of the rich and powerful. And this happens repeatedly. I mean, like I said, there were no financial crises in the 50s and the 60s. They started under Reagan. They've been increasing ever since. And as long as we have this system of a government-insured finance, it's called too big to fail, it'll continue.
The gentleman just before me asked about what we can do, and that question stimulated one. I think of two things. One is the bill for a state bank that's right in front of our legislature right now. One like North Dakota has for 50 years, and they don't have a deficit. So that's one that's right now. And there's the other one is I understand the person who producer of the King's Speech that won the Pulitzer, the Oscar, has come out with a movie called Miral, M-I-R-A-L, because he said there'll be no solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until we understand the Palestinian side. And of course that's being attacked as being one-sided. But I understand it's being suppressed. I found it was on shortly for a while in Portland, but when I called around here, they said, oh, well, that's just being shown at art theaters. How is that kind of suppression accomplished here? Is this the APAC, or where is it coming from, and what can we do?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. So there's a pro-Palestinian movie that is being repressed?
Yes, put out by the person who just won the big Oscar, the King's Speech.
Protest outside the movie theaters, or go to the studios, or whoever runs this stuff, and make it clear that you don't want to accept that kind of censorship.
How's
Plus,
that
or run them somewhere else.
How's it accomplished in this country? How do they accomplish it?
How do they accomplish it?
I
don't know what happened in this particular case, but it's a centralized control of distribution of movies.
Okay.
And so wherever that center is, they say what's going to be shown.
Okay, thank you.
But that means it's not graven in stone. First of all, you can get around it by doing it yourself, like movies could be shown here, I presume. And I think the centers of censorship, whatever they are, can be directly protested.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. This will be short. Thank you. Egypt, the spring there, the recent referendum, the yes vote, the stoning of al-Baradei. How optimistic are you that we have something good happening there?
I'm sorry.
Am I too quiet?
How optimistic about Egypt?
Yes, please.
Well, again, it's not something happening on Mars. We can affect it. I mean, what the U.S. government is doing is influencing it. And the U.S. government has a policy, a very clear policy. It's a familiar one. Like I said, it happens over and over, dictatorship after dictatorship. Try to restore the old regime. Now, we don't have to support that. In fact, we don't even have to tolerate it. We could support democracy in Egypt, means protesting our own government, which doesn't want it for the reasons I mentioned. But so it's not something, like I said, like Mars. It's not on Mars. It's happening here. We can affect it. What's likely to happen? It's hard to say. I mean, the old regime is, of course, digging in its heels. They want to maintain themselves. They have some new names. They maintain control of the elite, and the military are still in power. They'll try to hang on and get whatever they can. There's torture going on. The security forces are back under a different name. On the other hand, the protesters are still at it. They're showing up constantly, regularly, demanding more. They're protesting the military now. Could lead to a direct confrontation with the military, which could be pretty ugly. That's, again, crucial where the U.S. stands. Will it permit a massacre in Tahrir Square the way it did in Pearl Square in Bahrain, say? I don't think you could. I can't predict. Nobody could predict that it was going to start, and nobody can predict where it goes. It'll depend on the fortitude and commitment of the participants and the way in which external powers, mainly the U.S., will react to it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a lecture by Professor Noam Chomsky, speaking at Pacifica University in Forest Grove, Oregon. The title of this lecture is Prospects for Peace in the Middle East. To find out more about Noam Chomsky and his work, please visit the Chomsky Archive website at chomsky.info. To provide support for humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon, please visit the Carol Chomsky Memorial Fund website at chomskyfund.org. This program was produced by PDxJustice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org. And write to us with your questions and comments at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. You can also view many of our more recent programs in high-definition format, streaming direct to your television via the Netflix Instant View service by selecting the Vimeo video channel. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.